We're going to go back into trusts this morning and look at it a little bit deeper. There's a lot of information out there, but the trust is a very interesting device in law, and it may be more fundamental to what's going on in our lives than any of us would ever guess. Certainly, I don't have the end. I'm not the end all be all here. I'm just a beginner like everybody else. I always share my sources so I don't come out sounding like I'm some grand poobah when I'm not. I'm a novice at all this stuff. I like to think of my education here, self-education, as being very, very broad. Now, there's a few places where I've sunk post holes and wells, but mostly it's just very broad. It's a generalist, if you will, rather than a specialist. I'm not an expert, say. I kind of find it repugnant even to say those phrases in association with myself. But let's go back in. We're going to start once again, partly for the reason of understanding the process. Not that it's, so great, but it really does reflect, what I do really does reflect this idea of this trivium and quadrivium, the 7, liberal arts and so on and so forth, that we discussed. It starts with grammar. We've always emphasized how important it is to get into your dictionaries and look at the words and the usages of the words. And it's not just the dictionary meanings and senses of words, but it's also how they're used, learning how to diagram a sentence. If we were to, for instance, go to Wisconsin, and we've got all these people, some of them actually are Wisconsin people, and others are bussed in from unions around America. But if we were to go into the rotunda up there, for instance, and set a requirement from the state, Walker there, from the state, that contracts for teachers would have to be read, understood, interpreted, and essays written by their graduating senior class if they were anticipating any kind of a raise at all. In other words, if the students in the schools, much like back in Greece and Rome, if the students in the schools didn't understand the language in the contracts that the teachers were bargaining for, then the contract would just be void and null. Right? If they weren't doing well enough in the first 13 years, including kindergarten, for the student's body to be able to understand contract law, if the young people were graduating out of high school and they didn't understand the employment contract of their teachers and couldn't, orate upon it and debate it, then the teachers would get no increase in pay. That might change things around a little bit for the teachers. They would see how complicit they are in the deliberate dumbing down of America. But a trust, going back again, looking at the grammar, starting with the dictionary definitions, and we'll go over here to the Black's Law Dictionary in a moment, the 4th edition. But understanding then how to diagram the sentences and see how the prepositional phrases work here, and the adjectives and the adjectivals and the conjunctions and all of that, and the definite articles, and how each of those means something, and all of the punctuation. I'm always slayed in myself that when I'm writing something that I still have so much trouble with comma usage. Something simple like comma usage. Didn't learn it in school and have had to try and force myself to understand it. We'll pick it up with a discussion of the trust in the second hour, and your calls are welcome. 866-841-1065. And so once again, we're back here, our Wednesday, March the 2nd, 2011, 2-hour broadcast to Become Vocal Local. We're going to go back into the trust. I'm going to start out of the American past and present, Devine, Bean, Frederickson, and Williams. It's a college level, I guess you'd say, college level American history textbook could be considered. And it's huge. I mean, we're not talking about a small work here. This thing has got well over 1,000 pages in it. And it's a very good book. Picked it up at a flea market for nothing, virtually. And have read it. And come back to these various and sundry textbooks that I've collected over the years, and as I continue my own research in various sources, you find that a lot of this material is not accurate, that it presents a kind of an Americanism and a nationalism that is repugnant to anybody that's really seeking the truth, but it does give you a snapshot as to what was being taught 20 years ago. This was published in the 1980s. 20 years ago in school, that then, the teachers that are out there in school teaching today and the people out in business, they all believe this stuff, all right? This is what they learn in school, and don't you dare touch my degree. You know what I mean? It's that sheepskin hanging over your privates. that means more to you than anything else, right? Master Masons. Anyway, in 1904, this is a section out of here we talked about yesterday, page 668, Busting the Trust, talks about the Roosevelts. That would be Teddy. In 1904, the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, upheld the suit against Northern Securities and ordered the company dissolved. Roosevelt was jubilant. You know, he wanted to bust the trust. And he followed up the victory with several other antitrust suits. In 1902, he had moved against the Beef Trust, an action applauded by Western farmers and urban consumers alike. After a lull, he initiated suits in 1906 and 1907 against the American Tobacco Company. Boy, they've been hammered right up till today. The DuPont Corporation, sound familiar? The New Haven Railroad, and Standard Oil. Rockefellers, and Rockefellers. But Roosevelt's policies were not always clear, nor his actions always consistent. Remember, we talked about the creation of this Interstate Commerce Commission. Everybody was ticked off, unhappy. We had all of these little fragmented railroads that had been built, some poorly, some sloppily, some hastily, always at a great expense to the public, always gathering up huge tracts, vast tracts of land, whacking the engines whenever they could, Pilgrim, right? And it was pretty light on railroading, actually. But in the end, we had all of these little unions all over the place, and they were causing great mayhem in the system because, let's say you had a 200-mile road, and everybody else had to crowd through you, and so you drag up your prices to travel on your section of the road as you went from Chicagoland to New York, for instance, or something. And so there was a great clamor for uniformity. So they created this Interstate Commerce Commission, Interstate Commerce Commission. But originally, you know, when it set out to solve the complaints of the people, satisfy all the cheating people. But in the end, it was peopled by people from the railroads, and then all business continued as they were. From that time forward, they just controlled the legislation. So, back to the discussion. But Roosevelt's policies were not always clear, nor was actions always consistent. Rare is the day that you'll ever discover or read about a president in this country that wasn't bought and sold by the corpse in advance. The same goes in both houses of Congress, and the same happens in your local court system and in the U.S. Supreme Court. Again, Roosevelt's policies were not always clear. You know, Barry the Super, he's always going, let me be perfect, let me make this perfect. I want to be clear on this. I want to be clear on this. Well, why don't you just speak clearly, Barry, and we'll all accept that, all right? He invited Morgan to the White House, JP, to confer with him and allowed the president of National City Bank to preview a draft of his third annual message to Congress. Of course, the other day, you know, we've got these great huddles that the usurper is doing now with the same corporatist batards at the top of it all. Roosevelt also asked for and received business support in his bid for re-election in 1904. Of course. Large donations came in from industrial leaders. 106 years ago, we've learned nothing. Left, right. The established two-party political system, they don't represent you, they don't represent me, nor can they. They are themselves corporations, obviously. They're standing committees. It's a real crafty little trick in law, but nevertheless. Morgan himself later testified that he gave $150,000, which in those days added up to something real, to Roosevelt's campaign. In 1907, the president permitted Morgan's U.S. Steel to absorb the Tennessee Coal and Iron Company, an important competitor. Paybacks. Roosevelt, in truth, was not a trust buster, although he was frequently called that. William Howard Taft, his successor in the White House, initiated 43 antitrust indictments in 4 years, nearly twice as many as the 25 Roosevelt initiated in the 7 years of his presidency. And then it goes on and talks about the square deal in the coal fields, etc. But let's go back into this book one more time. Now we'll jump over to the Universal World Reference Encyclopedia, a common encyclopedia of the day. It's one of those subscription encyclopedias. The book salesmen would come around to the farms and, you know, just sell a household this little set, and then they would put it on the shelf, and then everyone would look at it, right? And that's what this is. But some of these articles are surprisingly informative. They really do help you to get a broader understanding. We start in the dictionaries. Actually, we hear something, and then we go into the dictionaries and try and find some understanding of it, something we heard, something we didn't understand. And we move from the dictionaries in my system then on to the encyclopedias and flesh it out there. According to Deborah Bouchot's book, Legal Writing, Research and Writing for the Paralegal, these are all considered secondary sources, but they help to get you on track. You're looking for the law in all of this and the evidence and the facts. So you go into the encyclopedias, and then, lo and behold, the encyclopedias, because they mention law, legislation, they mention authors, sometimes a good encyclopedia like the Britannica, the Americana, and others, the Encyclopedia of Social Sciences. They have huge bibliographies at the ends of each of these articles that you can then go from the dictionaries to the encyclopedias, from the encyclopedias to the law and to the authors. And in this process then, you can really get on base with some of these more tickly and important issues. A trust, a right of property, real or personal, held by one party for the benefit of another. The party holding is called the trustee. And the party for whose benefit the right is held is called, again, it's sistiqui or something like that. It's French, law French, trust, or the beneficiary. So you've got the trustee on one side, and then you've got the beneficiary. The trustee, he's the guy that's holding. The beneficiary is the one that is going to be benefited. The party establishing the trust is variously called, and we brought this out yesterday, called the donor, the creator, the settlor, the trustor, or the founder. And I want you to keep that in mind. I mean, this is one of the few places where I've got that list. But to me, it looks just like the Declaration of Independence, looks just like the Constitutions, just looks like what's happened in Israel, the Gaza, the settlements. Right back.